The rain started a week ago. At least that's what the old-timer at the gas station told me. He said it like it was a point of pride, like this little town had accomplished something by having a sky that wouldn't quit leaking. He wiped my windshield with a grimy rag. His eyes squinted against the downpour. "Ain't no break in it," he'd said. "Ground's so full of water the dead are probably floating." I laughed then. I'm not laughing now. My name is Leo. And this is my first night. The car's wipers were fighting a losing battle, thumping back and forth like a frantic heartbeat. The headlights cut two weak yellow cones through the wall of water, just enough to show me the twisting, narrow road that led to Oak Haven Rest. A cemetery. My new office. The guy who hired me, a Mr. Henderson, had been in a hurry. The interview lasted 10 minutes, most of which he spent looking at the rain sliding down the window of his stuffy little office. "Previous fella left without notice," he'd muttered, not meeting my eyes. "Just need a warm body, a presence. Don't fall asleep. Don't vandalize anything. Call this number if you see anything unusual." He'd slid a single, creased business card across the desk. The phone number on it was smudged. Unusual. What a word. I pulled up to the black iron gates. They were already open, which felt wrong. Like the place was expecting me. Beyond them, rows of headstones stood like a crowd of gray, slouching figures in the gloom. I killed the engine, and the world shrank to the sound of the rain, a constant hissing roar on the roof of my beat-up sedan. For a few minutes, I just sat there, watching the water race in rivulets down the windshield, blurring the world outside into a watercolor painting of gray and green. My own breath fogged the glass. This was just a job, a paycheck. After the last few months, I'd take anything. A warm body, a presence. That's all I had to be. The shift was 10 hours, 10 to 8, alone. I took a deep breath, shoved the car door open, and was instantly drenched. The cold seeped through my jacket in seconds. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers numb, and finally found the one for the guard shack. It was a small prefab building tucked just inside the gate, half hidden by a drooping willow tree. The key turned with a screech, and the door swung inward, releasing a smell of damp wood, stale coffee, and something else. Something earthy, like wet clay. I flicked the light switch. A single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling buzzed to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the tiny room. There was a desk, a rickety chair, a dead plant, and an ancient radio set crackling with static. On the wall was a map of the grounds, the plastic cover clouded with age, and on the desk a single heavy-duty flashlight. My patrol was simple, a loop. Down the main path, cut through the old section, circle the Mausoleum Hill and back. Henderson said to do it once an hour. Just to stretch your legs, he'd said. But I knew what it was for. It was to keep you from going crazy, from staring at these four walls until your mind started playing tricks on you. The first few hours crawled by. I tried the radio, but all I could find was more static or fragments of country songs, twisted and broken by the storm. I read the previous guard's logbook. Entries were brief, mundane. 11:47 p.m., heard animal in North Hedge. 2:15 a.m., car passed on main road. The last entry, dated 5 days ago, just said, "The rain is so loud." The handwriting on that last one was different. Shaky. I did my first patrol at 11 p.m. Stepping back out into the rain felt like a small relief. The flashlight beam was a solid, comforting thing, cutting a path through the darkness. I followed the gravel path, the stones squelching under my boots. The headstones watched me pass. Angels with eroded faces, simple crosses, a few larger, more ornate monuments. The water had pooled in the carved letters of the names, making them stand out black against the gray stone. Beloved father. Devoted wife, asleep in the arms of Jesus. I was just a man walking in the rain. That's all. It was on my third patrol, around 2 a.m., that I first heard it. I was at the highest point of the grounds, near the old mausoleum, a small marble building that looked like a forgotten Greek temple. The wind was howling around its corners, whipping the rain into a frenzy. And underneath the wind, I thought I heard a voice. I stopped dead, my heart giving a hard thump against my ribs. I turned my head, straining to listen. It was just the wind. It had to be. It sounded like a woman whispering. But the words were lost, torn apart by the gale. It was coming from down the hill, from the oldest part of the cemetery where the stones leaned into each other like tired old men. I stood there for a full minute, my knuckles white on the flashlight. Nothing. Just the endless, hissing rain and the moan of the wind through the trees. "You're tired," I told myself. "Your brain is looking for patterns in the noise. It's what brains do." I finished the loop, walking a little faster this time. The guard shack felt a little less like a prison when I got back. I poured a cup of bitter, lukewarm coffee from the thermos and tried to shake the chill. It was just the wind, but an hour later on the next patrol, I heard it again. This time, I was down in the old section. The path was mud here, sucking at my boots. The headstones were so old the names were just ghosts of letters. I was shining my light on a particularly tall obelisk, watching the water run down its sides. When the voice came again, it was clearer, not a whisper but a murmur, a conversation. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the cadence. A man's voice, low and steady, and then a higher, softer reply. It sounded close, like it was just on the other side of a thick hedge of overgrown boxwood. My blood went cold. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the rain. "Is someone out here?" The voices stopped. The silence that rushed in was louder than the storm. It was a listening silence. I stood there, frozen, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I swept it over the boxwood. There was no one. Of course there was no one. Who would be out here in a graveyard in this weather having a chat? A presence, Henderson had said. Just a presence. I backed away, my heart hammering in my throat. I didn't finish the patrol. I just walked quickly at first, then at a jog back to the shack. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, something the previous guard's logbook never mentioned doing. I sat at the desk, breathing hard, water pooling on the floor from my clothes. The rain drummed on the roof. "It's the wind," I repeated in my head. "It's the wind in the trees. It's water running through the old drainage pipes. It's your mind, Leo. Your mind is still broken from everything that happened. This is just what it does now. It invents things in the dark. I believed that. I had to. For the next hour, I didn't move. I just stared at the map on the wall, tracing the loop of my patrol with my eyes. I didn't hear the voices again. The radio static seemed quieter. The coffee pot let out a soft, gurgling sigh. Then, at exactly 4:17 a.m., the voices started again. But this time, they weren't distant. They weren't coming from outside. They were a soft, overlapping murmur, seeping through the walls of the guard shack itself. A man's low, patient tone. A woman's gentle, sighing reply. They weren't talking to me. They were just talking, as if they were sitting in the corner just beyond the reach of the dim yellow light. I didn't turn. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, my hands flat on the desk, and listened to the dead have a conversation in my ear. I don't know how long I sat there listening to them, the voices in the shack. They weren't loud. They weren't angry. They were just there, a low, steady murmur, like a radio left on in another room. I couldn't make out any words. It was just the sound of a conversation, the rise and fall of two people talking about things I would never understand. My whole body was rigid. A statue frozen at a desk. I was afraid that if I moved even an inch, they would notice me. They would stop their gentle talking and turn their attention to the living, breathing thing in the room with them. But then, as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The silence that came back was heavy, thick. It was filled only by the relentless drumming of the rain on the metal roof. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. It shuddered out of me, shaky and weak. Maybe I had fallen asleep. Maybe the stress, the lack of proper sleep for months had finally caught up to me. That had to be it. A waking dream. A stress-induced hallucination. My mind trying to fill the terrible silence of this place, I made a decision. I wouldn't tell Henderson. He'd think I was crazy. He'd fire me on the spot. And I needed this job. I needed the money. So I did the only thing I could do. I pretended it didn't happen. I stood up, my joints cracking in the quiet. I forced myself to pick up the flashlight. I had to do my patrol. If I skipped it, that would be admitting something was wrong. And nothing was wrong. I was just tired. Stepping back outside was like walking into a cold, wet fist. The rain hadn't let up at all. If anything, it was coming down harder. I clicked on the flashlight, its beam a weak, defiant little star in all that darkness. I stuck to the main path this time. I didn't look at the old section. I didn't go near the mausoleum hill. I just walked, my head down, the gravel crunching and squelching under my feet. Just the wind, I chanted in my head like a prayer. Just the rain. Just your tired mind. That's when I heard the new sound. It was underneath the rain. A sharp rhythmic tap. Tap, tap. I stopped walking. My heart did that little stumble again. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I swung the flashlight beam around. The trees dripped. The headstones gleamed. Nothing moved. I took another step. Squelch. And there it was again. Tap! Tap! Tap. It was faster than the rain. More deliberate. It wasn't random. It had a pattern. A short tap, a pause, then 3 quick ones in a row. Then it would repeat. I started walking again, faster now, trying to outpace it. But the sound kept pace with me. It was in the rain, but it wasn't the rain. It was something else. Something underneath. I practically ran the last 100 yards back to the guard shack. I fell into the chair, my chest heaving, dripping water all over the floor. I needed a distraction. Anything. I reached for the old radio on the desk, fiddling with the knobs, trying to find a clear station, any voice, any music, to drown out the memory of the tapping and the voices. All I got was static, a harsh white noise that filled the small room. I was about to turn it off in disgust when I heard it. Tap, tap, tap! It was coming from the radio's speaker. The same pattern. Short tap, pause, 3 quick taps. It was clearer now, sharper, cutting through the static. My hand froze on the dial. This wasn't my mind. This was real. It was coming through the radio. I leaned closer, my ear almost touching the grill of the speaker. The static hissed. The rain drummed on the roof, and beneath it all, the tapping continued. A cold metallic sound. It was Morse code. I knew that much from a boyhood scout manual I'd read a million years ago. I didn't know all of it, but I recognized the rhythm of letters. This was a message. I fumbled in the desk drawer, my hands trembling, and found a chewed-up pencil and a scrap of paper, an old supply receipt. I started writing down the patterns as I heard them. Short, long, long, long. That was a B, I was pretty sure. Then short, short, short. That was an S. Long, short, long, long. That had to be an L. The letters came slowly, repeating the same sequence over and over. I scribbled them down, my handwriting a frantic scrawl. B-S-L. It didn't make any sense. B-S-L. Was it an acronym? Some kind of code? I listened for what felt like an hour, the pencil gripped tight in my fist. The sequence never changed. B-S-L, and then a new letter was added. A single O, B-S-L-O. My eyes drifted from the scrap of paper up to the clouded map of the cemetery on the wall. My gaze traveled over the plastic-covered paths and sections, and then it stopped. In the oldest part of the grounds, the part where the headstones were so worn they looked like melted candles, there was a small labeled section, the Blackwood family plot. But next to it, crammed into a corner of the map, was an abbreviation I hadn't noticed before. BSL, the words sat on the paper, written in my own shaky hand. Buried. I stared at it until the letters stopped making sense. Just a jumble of lines and curves. My mind felt like that too. Scrambled. I crumpled the paper into a tight ball and threw it into the metal trash can. It wasn't real. None of it was real. This place, this job, it was getting to me. That's all. The rest of the shift was a blur. I didn't do another patrol. I just sat in that chair, watching the hands on the cheap wall clock move with a slow, cruel laziness. The rain kept falling. The radio stayed silent. Every time I started to feel a little normal, I'd remember the voices or the tapping, and a cold shiver would run right through the center of my chest. When the first gray light of dawn finally seeped through the grimy window, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It wasn't sunny. The sky was just a lighter shade of gray, but it was enough. My shift was over. I practically ran to my car. The engine coughed to life, and I sped down that winding road away from Oak Haven Rest. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. Not once. I spent the day in my rented room, the blinds pulled down. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that word, buried. I heard the tapping. It was like a splinter in my brain. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I'd call Henderson, quit, find something else, anything. But then I thought about the rent, the empty fridge, the stack of bills on my kitchen table. I was trapped. So when evening came, I got back in the car and drove to the cemetery. The rain was still falling. It felt like it would never, ever stop. The second night started the same as the first. The same hissing rain, the same smell of damp and decay in the shack. I did my first patrol with my shoulders hunched, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Everything looked normal, just wet and quiet. It was on my second patrol, around midnight, that I saw them. The mud. It had been raining for so long that the ground was pure soup, especially off the gravel paths. As I walked, my beam swept over the grass and the edges of the graves, and that's when I saw the first set. Footprints. They were deep, clear impressions in the thick mud between two old headstones. They were bare feet, small, like a child's. My blood went cold. I stopped, my heart hammering. Who would be out here barefoot in this weather? I shone the light all around, panning across the rows of stones. Nothing moved. The rain fell in sheets. There was no one. I told myself it was a trick. The rain could have made a pattern that just looked like feet. That had to be it. I kept walking, my pace quicker now. My eyes glued to the ground, and I saw more of them. Another set, near a weeping angel statue. These were bigger. A man's bare feet, sunk deep into the muck. The prints led from behind the statue and just stopped in the middle of a patch of grass. Further on, near the mausoleum, I saw a set that made me freeze all over again. They weren't human. They were long and thin, with three-pointed toes, like some kind of large bird. But they were huge. Each print was the size of my boot. This wasn't the rain. This wasn't my mind. Something was walking here. After dark, in the pouring rain, I ran back to the guard shack, my breath catching in my throat. I slammed the door and locked it, my back pressed against the wood. I needed to see. I needed proof. There were cameras. Henderson had mentioned a system, an old monitor in the corner covered by a dusty cloth. I pulled the cloth off. The screen was small, black and white, split into 4 different views of the cemetery. The image was grainy, washed out by the rain. I could see the main gate, the mausoleum hill, the old section, and a view of the central path. I pulled up a chair and stared at the screen. For a long time, nothing. Just the blur of rain on the lens. Then a glitch. The screen for the old section flickered, the image rolling for a second before snapping back. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the glass. There, in the top left corner of the old section screen, a figure. It was just a tall, thin shadow, standing perfectly still between 2 headstones. It was so faint I almost missed it. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, facing the camera. I watched, unable to look away. The figure didn't move. It was a statue, maybe, but I'd walked that section. I knew every stone. There was no statue there. Another flicker. This time on the mausoleum camera. A different figure, shorter, wider, also perfectly still, staring right at the lens. My hands were clenched into fists on the desk. This was it. This was proof. I wasn't crazy. I grabbed for the radio, my fingers fumbling for the talk button to call Henderson. I had to report this. But as my thumb pressed down, all 4 screens flickered at once. When the image returned, the figures were gone. All of them. The grainy screens showed nothing but empty, rain-swept graves. I sat there, the silent radio in my hand, and stared at the empty screens. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart, a frantic, trapped rhythm that was starting to sound an awful lot like Morse code. The silence after the screens went back to normal was the worst part. It was a heavy, waiting silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring at the 4 empty views on the monitor. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. I was sure of what I had seen, but the proof was gone. I couldn't call Henderson now. What would I say? The cameras glitched and I saw some shadows? He'd tell me to get some sleep. Or worse, he'd fire me. And I was starting to realize I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to understand. The voices, the tapping, the footprints, the figures. It was all pointing to something. And that word, the one I'd crumpled up and thrown away, was stuck in my head. buried. The rain let up a little just before dawn. It didn't stop, but it softened from a roar to a steady, miserable drizzle. As the sky lightened from black to gray, I forced myself to do one last patrol. My body felt heavy, like I was moving through deep water. I walked the main loop, my eyes scanning the ground. The footprints were still there, already filling with murky water. The small ones, the large ones, the ones that weren't human. They were real. I hadn't imagined them. I found myself drifting towards the oldest part of the cemetery, the section the map had labeled BSL Ossuary. The headstones here were so weathered they were just lumps of stone, like rotten teeth pushing up from the gums of the earth. The air felt colder here, thicker, and that's when I saw it. A patch of earth right in the middle of the ossuary section that looked different. The grass was patchy and yellow, and the dirt beneath was dark and loose, like it had been recently turned over. It was a grave, but there was no headstone. Just a small metal marker stuck in the ground, so rusted I couldn't read the number. I stood over it, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. This was it. I could feel it. This was where the tapping had been coming from. This was the source, and then I heard it again. Not from the radio. This was fainter, muffled. It was coming from the ground beneath my feet. Tap, tap, tap. It was the same pattern. Slow, deliberate. A desperate, rhythmic knocking from under 6 feet of wet soil. My first thought wasn't of ghosts. It was of a person. Someone was down there. Someone was buried alive. The thought was so horrifying, so immediate, that it cut through all the fear and confusion. This wasn't about voices or shadows anymore. This was about a life. I fell to my knees, the wet mud soaking through my pants. I pressed my ear to the cold, wet earth. The tapping was clearer now. Tap! 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 It was weak. Fading. I hear you! I shouted, my voice hoarse. I'm here, hold on! I looked around, frantic. I needed a shovel. Something. The guard shack had a small tool shed attached to the side. I sprinted back, my legs burning, and wrenched the shed door open. Inside, leaning against a wall, was a single, rusty spade. I didn't hesitate. I ran back to the disturbed patch of earth, the spade feeling heavy and wrong in my hands. This was a grave. I was about to desecrate a grave. But the tapping, it was a person. It had to be. I drove the spade into the soft earth. It went in easily. Too easily. The dirt was loose, as if it had been dug up and put back only days ago. I threw shovelfuls of mud over my shoulder, my breath puffing in white clouds in the cold air. The tapping had stopped now. A terrible silence had fallen over the ossuary. The only sound was the scrape of the spade and the frantic beat of my own heart. I dug deeper. The hole was about 3 feet down when the tip of the spade hit something solid. Wood. A coffin. My stomach twisted. This was it. This was real. I dropped the spade and used my hands, scraping the wet dirt away from the lid. It wasn't a modern sealed casket. It was an old, simple wooden box already rotting and warped. It looked cheap. It looked temporary. The tapping didn't start again. The silence from the coffin was absolute. I found the edge of the lid. I took a deep, shuddering breath, said a silent prayer for forgiveness, and I pried it open. The wood splintered with a sickening crack. The smell that rose from the coffin wasn't decay. It was the smell of wet earth and old wood. And the coffin? It was empty. Well, almost empty. There was no body. No bones, no tattered burial clothes. Just a single object, lying right in the center of the bare, rotting wood. It was clean, as if it had just been placed there. I reached down, my hand trembling so badly I could barely control it. My fingers closed around cold, smooth plastic. I lifted it out into the gray morning light. It was a security badge, clipped to a blue lanyard. There was a photo on it, a man with tired eyes and a forced, nervous smile. The name underneath the photo was printed in clear, bold letters. It was my name, and it was my face staring back at me from the ID badge I held in my muddy, shaking hand. The badge I knew for a fact was clipped to my belt right then. I fumbled at my side, my fingers finding the familiar shape of my own badge. I held them up side by side. They were identical. The same photo, the same name, the same employee number. One was warm from my body heat. The other was ice cold from the earth. I dropped the badge from the coffin. It landed face up in the mud, my own picture smiling blankly at the weeping sky. I stumbled back from the hole, from the empty coffin, my mind screaming. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't a message. It was a delivery. They weren't showing me that I was in danger. They were showing me that I was already one of them. Funny how your life can shrink. A few years ago, my world was the whole city. Sirens, streetlights, the crackle of the police radio always pulling me towards some new chaos. Now my world is 200 acres of silence and dead grass. Oak Haven Cemetery. My name is Frank, and this is my post. They hired me because I was a cop for 25 years. We've had some vandalism, Frank, the manager had said. Kids, probably. Looking for thrills. We just need a presence. Someone who won't spook easy. I didn't tell him that after 25 years, everything spooks you a little. You just get better at ignoring it. The job is simple. 10-hour shift, 10 at night till 8 in the morning. I drive a slow loop in a beat-up golf cart, its electric motor whining softly in the dark. I check the gates. I look for broken fences. And every hour on the hour, I key the mic on the old two-way radio and call in. Unit 7, signal check. All quiet. A voice, usually Brenda, the dispatcher at the main security office a few miles away, comes back. Copy, Unit 7. Quiet here too. That's it. That's the whole dance. For 10 hours. Tonight was different. The rain started around 11, a fine cold mist that made the headstones gleam under my cart's headlights. It made the world feel small, closed in. Just me and the dead, all of us getting wet together. My first signal check at midnight went fine. Brenda's voice was crisp, clear. Copy, Unit 7, stay dry out there. I did my next loop. The place was a ghost town, in a literal sense, I guess. The only sound was the whisper of my tires on the wet gravel and the constant, gentle hiss of the rain. I found myself looking forward to the next signal check, just to hear another human voice. At 1 a.m., I lifted the radio. Unit 7, signal check. All quiet, the speaker hissed back at me. Not silence, not Brenda's voice. Just static. A long, empty burst of white noise. I frowned. Probably the weather. These old radios were sensitive. I tried again. Unit 7, signal check. Do you copy? The static crackled, and for a second I thought I heard something. A voice, but twisted, like a station tune just off the frequency. It was gone as soon as I heard it. Must be the storm, I muttered to myself. It was a thing I did now. Talk to myself. Just to break the quiet. I went about my patrol, but a little knot of unease had tightened in my gut. A cop's gut, the one that tells you when something is off. I drove a little slower, my flashlight beam piercing the drizzle, scanning the rows of graves. Nothing moved. Nothing was out of place. At 2 a.m., I keyed the mic again. My thumb pressed the button a little harder than usual. Unit 7, signal check. Is anyone reading me? This time the static was louder, more aggressive. It spat and sizzled in my hand. And then, a voice cut through it. A man's voice, low and flat, stripped of all feeling. No one is coming. The words were crystal clear. And then they were gone, swallowed by the hiss. My hand tightened on the radio. That wasn't Brenda. That wasn't anyone from the office. That was a man. And he sounded close. Who is this? I barked into the radio, my old cop voice taking over. This is a secured channel. Identify yourself, only static answered. I scanned the darkness around me. I was near the old mausoleum, a big marble building that looked like a tomb for a giant. The rain dripped from its roof in steady, ticking drops. There was no one there. Of course there was no one there. I got back in my cart and drove, my heart beating a little too fast. It was just a prank. Some kid with a scanner and a cheap radio thinking he was funny. Messing with the night watchman. I'd heard of it happening before. That had to be it. For the next hour, I tried to convince myself of that. But my eyes kept darting to the shadows. My ears strained, listening for anything over the rain. AM. The witching hour. That's what they call it, right? My hand was actually shaking a little as I picked up the radio. I took a deep breath. Unit 7. Signal check. The static erupted immediately. It was a roar. And in the center of that roar, a new voice. A woman's voice this time. It was broken, desperate, a sob tangled in the electronic noise. Can't get out. The dirt is so heavy. A cold finger traced a path down my spine. This wasn't a prank. The fear in that voice was real. It was a raw, primal terror that you can't fake. I slammed the radio down on the passenger seat as if it had burned me. I stared at it. This little black box of plastic and wires, now a window to... To what? To somewhere else? To someone else's nightmare? I looked out at the cemetery. The headstones stood in silent rows. The rain fell. It was all so peaceful, so still. But the radio in my cart was telling another story. A story of being trapped, of being buried, of no one coming, and I realized, with a dread that was slowly freezing me from the inside out, that the voices on the radio, they weren't coming from outside the graveyard. They were coming from inside it. I woke up to the static before I even opened my eyes. It was one of those nights where the air felt too thick, too close, and the kind that made the walls seem like they were leaning in just a little too much. I sat up slowly, the old chair creaking beneath me, and reached for the radio on the shelf. I hadn't turned it on before bed, I never did, but tonight the low hum was already there, alive, like it had been waiting for me. The static wasn't normal. It was sharper, more insistent, cutting through the quiet of my apartment like a knife through fog. I twisted the dial, half expecting nothing, half expecting... I didn't even know what I was expecting. A joke, a ghost, maybe both. The sound warped, stretched, and then voices. I froze. They were faint at first, buried under the hissing white noise. I leaned closer, pressing the receiver to my ear. Shots fired. 421 Maple Street. Units respond? The voice was distant, tinny, like it had traveled across decades. My stomach dropped. That street, that address. I had answered that call myself. I sat there frozen, heart hammering. The words continued, fragmented and broken by static. Suspect down. Need backup. Officer. I couldn't move. My fingers twitched, but my mind refused to obey. The names. The faces. The ones I remembered. The ones I had seen die under my own hands. Or maybe I hadn't stopped them in time. The radio clicked sharply, and the voice changed. Domestic disturbance. 15th Avenue. Male unconscious. Female screaming. Shots fired. It was like the city itself had reached back through the airwaves, dragging its tragedies into my living room. Each call hit me like a punch. I remembered walking those streets at night, sirens echoing in the empty blocks, neon lights flickering over wet asphalt. And now, I was sitting here, in the same room where I'd tried to forget it all, hearing it again. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles ached. The next call came slower, like it had been paused, waiting for me to notice. Multiple casualties. Elm Street. Officers down. Requesting immediate assistance. I swallowed hard, a dry, rattling sound. Elm Street. I had answered that one, too. I remembered the car, the smoke, the smell of burning rubber and blood. The officers had been gone before I arrived. I hadn't been able to save them. I hadn't been able to do anything. The static rose again, louder this time, like the radio itself was straining, almost alive, almost pleading. I pressed my palms against my ears, trying to shut it out. But it wasn't just sound. It was memory. It was guilt. It was everything I'd shoved into the dark corners of my mind. And now it was crawling back in. Report of body discovered. 7th Avenue, homicide. Caller states, the voice faltered. My chest tightened. My memories of that night came flooding back uninvited. The rain. The ambulance lights painting everything in red and blue. The look in the victim's eyes as I knelt beside them, helpless. That voice, that cry, and now it was being broadcast into my apartment through this cursed, static-filled box. I wanted to throw it across the room. I wanted to smash it, end this. But part of me, a part I didn't recognize anymore, wanted to listen. The next call was clearer, and I swear I could hear someone breathing in the background. 911, what's your emergency? I can hear him. He's inside! Please, send someone now. I remembered that night. The stairwell smelled of mildew and fear. I remember the door creaking as I pushed it open, flashlight cutting through the shadows. The man was already gone when I reached him, the blood pooling under the faint light. I had stood there, shaking, listening to nothing but the echo of my own breath. And now, through this radio, I was hearing it all again. The static warped into a low moan. The voices overlapped, cutting in and out. I could hear fragments of calls I didn't even remember answering. Woman screaming. Body found in alley. Officer down. Suspect armed. Each phrase was like a finger dragging across the back of my spine. I could feel the hairs standing on end, my skin crawling. My apartment felt smaller, tighter, like it had turned into the city streets I used to patrol. And somewhere deep inside me, a voice whispered that this wasn't random, that this wasn't just memory, that something was using those voices, calling me, luring me back. I tried to turn the radio off. I twisted the dial, pressed the button, slammed it down. Nothing. The static remained, and so did the voices. They weren't coming from the machine anymore. They were inside my head. Shots fired. 421 Maple Street. Units respond. The repetition made my chest ache. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I could feel sweat running down my back. I pressed my face into my hands, trying to will it away. But the sound didn't stop. The memories didn't stop. The guilt didn't stop. I remembered a man's eyes once, wide with terror, begging for mercy I couldn't give. I remembered the helplessness of running through empty corridors, chasing shadows that weren't there. And now I was back there, sitting on my chair in the middle of my apartment, reliving every failure through a broken, screaming speaker. The radio hissed, then shifted. The voices merged into something I didn't recognize immediately. A pattern, a rhythm, almost like words I hadn't heard before, spoken in a tone that wasn't human. I leaned in, straining to make sense of it. You cannot leave, cannot escape. I froze. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just memory anymore. It was a warning. The words slithered under my skin, crawling through my veins. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining things. But I wasn't. I knew I wasn't. The radio sputtered violently, sparks flying, and the voices became fragmented again. Back. Dead. Cannot. Here. Cannot stop. I buried my face in my hands, rocking slightly, whispering to myself that it was just the radio, just the static, just memory. But the coldness in my chest, the way the hair on my arms stood up, the metallic tang in my mouth, it told me otherwise. This was alive. Somehow it had remembered me, and it wasn't done with me yet. I could hear my own breathing now, ragged and shallow. I could hear the apartment settling, the floorboards groaning under the weight of my fear. And then for a moment, silence, absolute silence. It was like the world had held its breath, waiting for me to speak, to move, to react. And then softly, almost lovingly, the voice returned. 421, Maple Street. You remember. We remember. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. I sat there, a shell of a man who had walked the streets in uniform, who had faced criminals and chaos, and now I was being haunted by the echo of my own failures. The static slowly faded after that, but the silence it left behind was worse. I could still feel it, vibrating in my bones, whispering through the air like it had never left. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't dare. Every time I closed my eyes, the streets, the calls, the voices, they came back. Every time I thought I had escaped, they were there, watching, waiting, judging. By morning, the radio was quiet, dead, but I knew better. I knew it wasn't over. I knew somewhere deep inside that those voices were patient. And I was their next broadcast. I didn't touch the radio again that day. I couldn't. I just sat in the corner, staring at the walls, listening to the silence and pretending it was enough. But I knew it wasn't. Not really. The city, the calls, the dead, they were still alive in that little box. And they would speak again, because the voices, they never forget. I didn't make the next signal check. I sat in the golf cart, the rain pattering on the plastic roof, and I just stared at that radio. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical track to run on, but it was like my wheels were spinning in mud. A prankster with a radio? That idea was gone. It was shredded by the pure, undiluted horror in that woman's voice. The dirt is so heavy, you don't fake that. You can't. My training took over. Observe. Assess. I picked up the radio again, my grip careful like it was a live snake. I didn't press the talk button. I just held it, listening to the soft, waiting hiss of the open channel. And then a new sound broke through. Not a voice at first, a scuffling noise, like fabric rubbing against rough wood. then a low, guttural gasp for air. A man. He was struggling. He was suffocating. My own breath caught in my throat. I could feel it. The pressure. The panic. Then the voice came, choked and desperate. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I can't breathe." It was a nightmare. A live broadcast of a nightmare. I found my thumb pressing the talk button, my instincts screaming at me to respond, to help. "This is Unit 7, I said, my voice too loud in the quiet cart. "Where are you? Give me your location!" The static crackled, ignoring me completely. The man's voice came again, weaker now. "My chest. It's crushing me. The dark, so dark." And then another voice, this one clearer, cutting in over the dying man's gasps. It was flat, exhausted. "Just stop fighting it. It's easier if you just stop." I knew that voice. It was my voice. The realization didn't hit me all at once. It seeped in, cold and slow, like the cemetery damp. It was my voice, but from years ago. Younger, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The man on the radio kept gasping. No, I don't want to." And my voice answered, calm and final. "We've all been through it. It's too late for you now. Just let go." I dropped the radio. It clattered to the floor of the cart, the voices still spilling out. The gasping man. The calm, resigned voice that was mine. I fumbled for the volume knob, twisting it until the speaker went silent. My heart was hammering against my ribs. My hands were trembling. That conversation, I remembered it. Not from a dream, from a memory 5 years ago. My last month on the force. A call came in. A domestic disturbance, a bad part of town. My partner Mike and I responded. It was a routine call. They were always routine until they weren't. A man had barricaded himself in his basement with a shotgun. He was high, desperate. I was the one who talked to him. For an hour, I talked to him through the door. My voice calm, steady, a cop voice. I told him to put the gun down. I told him it would be easier if he just stopped fighting. He fired through the door. The blast took out the lock, the wood splintering. In the chaos that followed, he turned the gun on himself. I never forgot his last, wet gasps for air. The sound of his body hitting the concrete floor. The silence that came after. And now, here it was. Playing back to me on a dead channel in a graveyard. I felt sick. This wasn't someone else's horror. It was mine. These voices, they were echoes. Echoes of the moments I'd spent here, in this place, during my life. The moments of fear. The moments of death. I had to be sure. With a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, I reached down and slowly, carefully, turned the radio's volume back up. The static was softer now, a gentle sea of noise. And in it, I could hear more fragments, snippets of conversations I'd had with my ex-wife. The last argument, my voice, tired, saying, "I just can't do this anymore." The sound of a car door slamming, my own lonely footsteps on a pavement. It was all there. My life, my regrets, my endings, all of it, trapped in this frequency, looping forever in this cemetery. I looked out at the rows of graves. The rain had almost stopped. A faint gray light was beginning to touch the horizon. Dawn was coming, but a new, colder dawn was breaking inside of me. I thought about the previous guard, the one who left without notice. I thought about Henderson, the manager, and the way he wouldn't meet my eyes. He didn't hire me because I was a cop who wouldn't spook easy. He hired me because I was already haunted. This job wasn't about keeping vandals out. It was about keeping something in. Or maybe it was about giving a place for the echoes to gather, for the dead air to speak. The final signal check was at 7 a.m. I didn't drive the loop. I just sat there in the cart, the silent radio in my lap. When the time came, I didn't reach for it. I just watched the clock. And right on time, the radio crackled to life on its own. A voice came through. My voice, but from last night. From my first patrol. Unit 7, signal check. All quiet, it was perfect. A clean recording. A ghost of a moment, already set to repeat. I knew then that I'd never leave this job. Not really. Because a part of me, the most tired and broken parts, were already here. Buried not in the earth, but in the static. Playing on a loop, forever, in the dead air between the graves. The key was cold in my hand. It felt older than it was, the metal worn smooth in places. The realtor had handed it to me with a tight, sympathetic smile, said, "It's all yours, Sarah," and then practically ran back to her car. I didn't blame her. The place had a weight to it, my dad's place. The caretaker's shack at the edge of Blackwood Cemetery. It wasn't a house. It was a box made of gray, weathered wood, tucked under the sprawling branches of an oak tree so big it looked like it was holding the sky up. A single window, dark and empty, stared out at the rows of headstones. This is where he lived. For the last 10 years of his life, this is where he came home to. The letter from the lawyers said it was a heart attack. Quick, peaceful. They found him in his favorite chair, looking out that same window. I like to think that's true. I have to. I pushed the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy grinding click that echoed in the quiet. The door swung inward and the smell hit me first. Old wood, damp earth, and the faint sweet scent of my dad's pipe tobacco. It was still here, clinging to the curtains, the furniture, everything. It smelled like him. It smelled like home, and it broke my heart all over again. I stepped inside, my suitcase feeling stupid and out of place in my hand. The main room was one space, a tiny kitchenette with an old porcelain sink, a small table with one chair, and a worn armchair pointed towards the window. His chair. A narrow doorway led to what I assumed was the bedroom. Everything was neat, tidy, a little dusty, but perfect. It was like he'd just stepped out for a walk among the graves, his nightly ritual. A pair of his reading glasses sat on the arm of his chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle was on the table, a pencil resting in the groove. I ran my finger over the paper. He'd always been so good at those. The job came with the shack. That was the arrangement. The cemetery trust paid the bills, and the caretaker kept the grounds. Cared for, mowing the grass, trimming the hedges, keeping the gravel paths clear, making sure the guests, as Dad used to call them, had a peaceful rest. I was between jobs. My life in the city was a blur of temp work and takeout containers. This felt like a sign, a chance to be close to him in a weird way, to understand the silence he chose over the noise of the family he left behind. I unpacked my single suitcase. It didn't take long. I put my clothes in the empty drawer next to his old flannel shirts. I put my toothbrush in the metal holder next to his. It felt like I was moving in with a ghost. As the sun began to set, painting the sky, the word "stay" was written in the soft gray lead of his pencil. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. A part of me, the sensible part that still remembered city life and logic, screamed that I had just missed it before. That grief was making me see things. But I knew with a cold certainty that settled deep in my bones. That word had not been on the paper when I sat down. The rest of the night was long. Every creak of the old shack, every rustle of the oak tree outside the window felt like a sign. I slept fitfully in his narrow bed, the blanket smelling of him, my dreams filled with the sound of a pencil scratching on paper. The next day was overcast, the sky a flat, dull gray. The cemetery looked different in the daylight, less threatening but sadder. The peace was back, but it felt fragile now, like thin ice over deep water. I spent the day trying to learn my new job. I found his tools in a small shed out back, a rusty lawnmower, shears, a rake. I tried to mow a patch of grass, but the machine coughed and sputtered and died. I decided to just walk the grounds instead, picking up a few stray branches, getting a feel for the place. I found the spot where I'd felt that strange pressure the night before, near the bench by the pond. There was nothing there, just grass and a few dandelions. But as I turned to leave, my foot kicked something soft. It was a flower. A small white lily, its petals perfectly fresh, beaded with morning dew. It lay at the base of a small, unmarked headstone. The stone was so old it was just a smooth gray rock, worn down by 100 years of rain. There was no name, no date. It was odd, but I thought nothing of it. Maybe a visitor had left it yesterday. That night, the rain came back. It wasn't a storm, just a steady, soaking drizzle that made the world feel muffled and alone. I was in the kitchen, washing my dinner plate, when I saw her, a flicker of movement out the window. My heart jumped into my throat. I dropped the plate back into the sink with a clatter and rushed to the glass, wiping the condensation away with my sleeve. There, out in the rain, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. She wore a simple white dress, no coat, despite the cold drizzle. Her hair was long and dark, plastered to her head and shoulders by the rain. In her hands, she carried a small bunch of wildflowers. She wasn't looking at me. She was walking slowly, purposefully, between the headstones. She stopped at another old, unmarked grave, this one near the iron fence. She knelt down, her white dress pooling in the wet grass, and carefully laid a single flower against the stone. Then she stood up, turned, and walked deeper into the cemetery. Vanishing into the gloom and the rain, I didn't think. I wrenched the door open and ran out into the cold. "Hey, little girl! It's okay. Come here!" The rain soaked me instantly. I ran to the spot where I'd seen her, my breath puffing in frantic clouds. The grave was there, and at its base, a fresh white lily, just like the one I'd found that morning, but the girl was gone. I scanned the rows of headstones, turning in a full circle. There was nowhere she could have gone that quickly. It was a wide open space. The trees were too far away. It was like she had simply dissolved into the rain. A deep chill, colder than the rain, went through me. I went back inside, my clothes clinging to me, and locked the door. I spent the rest of the night watching the window, but I saw nothing else. The next morning, as soon as the sun was up, I went back out. The sky was clear, the grass sparkling. I went straight to the grave by the fence. There was no flower. The ground was just wet grass. I walked the entire cemetery, looking for any sign of her, for footprints, for anything. There was nothing. That night, the rain returned. And so did she. I was waiting by the window this time, and right around the same time I saw her, a small pale shape moving through the darkness. She walked the same path, stopped at another unmarked stone, and left her flower. This time, I moved slower. I opened the door quietly and stepped out, not calling to her. I just watched. She finished her quiet task and began to walk away. I followed, keeping my distance, my feet silent on the wet grass. She led me to the very back of the cemetery, to a section that was wild and overgrown. The headstones here were the oldest, tilting at crazy angles. And there, tucked against the back wall, was a small, forgotten plot. It was surrounded by a low, rusted iron fence. Inside, there were 3 small, unmarked stones. The girl in the white dress walked through the closed gate. Not opened it, walked through it, like it wasn't even there. She knelt, placed the last of her flowers on the smallest of the 3 graves, and then she faded. She didn't vanish. She just became transparent, like smoke, and then she was gone. I stood there in the rain, frozen to the spot. I wasn't scared anymore. Not in that heart-pounding way. This was a deeper, sadder kind of fear. I knew then that she wasn't a ghost haunting me. She was just staying, doing what she had always done. A little girl, forever bringing flowers to graves no one else remembered. A caretaker, just like my dad, just like me. I looked down at the grave she had just visited, the tiny, nameless stone, and I understood the word he had written on the crossword puzzle, stay. It wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. After seeing the girl fade away, the walk back to the shack felt different. The cemetery wasn't a scary place anymore. It was a sad place, a lonely place. And I was now a part of its quiet, endless routine. The rain had soaked me to the skin, but I barely felt the cold. My mind was filled with the image of that little girl in white, forever walking in the rain, forever leaving flowers for the forgotten. I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that my dad had seen her too. The word stay wasn't just for me. It was what he had done. Back inside, I peeled off my wet clothes and wrapped myself in one of his thick flannel robes. It smelled like him, pipe smoke and sawdust. I felt a calmness I hadn't felt since I got here. I was no longer an intruder. I was the new caretaker. That's when I noticed the door. It was in the back corner of the bedroom, almost hidden by a tall, old wardrobe. I'd seen it before, of course, but I'd assumed it was a closet. Now I saw it had a heavy brass lock on it, a lock that was firmly shut. I tried the knob. It didn't budge. I looked around the room for a key. I checked the drawers, the pockets of his jackets hanging in the wardrobe, even under the bed. Nothing. A locked door in a 2-room shack. My dad was a simple man. He didn't have secrets, or at least I never thought he did. The calm I'd felt began to curdle into a low, humming curiosity. What was in there? I remembered the tool shed. It was a mess of rusty garden implements and old paint cans, but on a high shelf behind a box of nails, I found a small metal box. Inside wasn't a key. It was a set of lockpicks. My breath caught in my throat. My dad, the quiet cemetery caretaker, owned lockpicks. The man who fixed my bike with patience and kind hands also knew how to open things that were meant to stay closed. I brought them inside, the cold metal feeling alien and dangerous in my hands. It took me almost an hour, my fingers fumbling, sweating despite the cool air. I'd seen it in movies, but the reality was frustrating, a delicate dance of pressure and tiny movements. Finally, with a click that seemed to echo in the silent room, the lock gave way. I pushed the door open. It wasn't a closet, it was a study. A tiny windowless room, just big enough for a small desk and a single chair. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and dust. And on the desk, stacked in neat, towering piles, were logbooks. Dozens of them. Simple, black-covered notebooks. I picked up the one on top. The cover was labeled in my father's neat handwriting. Observations, 2018. My heart was pounding. I sat down in his chair, the wood groaning under my weight, and I opened the book. The entries were brief, factual. Weather reports, groundskeeping notes, fixed fence post near Willow, cleared drain on North Path, and then, scattered throughout, were other entries. Just as factual, just as calm. October 14th. Rain. Observed the child in white at 11:34 p.m. North Sector. Unmarked plot. November 2nd. Heavy fog. Child appeared by the pond. Carried asters. Faded at 12:02 a.m. I put the 2018 book down and reached for an older one, 2009. The same thing. Entries about the girl. I pulled one from the bottom of the stack. The cover was brittle. The date read 1987. With trembling hands, I opened it. The handwriting was younger, sharper, but unmistakably his. May 5th. First night. Clear skies. Saw a little girl in a white dress near the old mausoleum. Called out. She vanished. Assumed she was a lost visitor. May 10th. Rain. Saw her again. Left a flower. She doesn't walk like a living child. She glides. I am not afraid. Page after page, year after year. A record of her. He had been watching her, documenting her appearances for over 30 years. He knew her patterns, the graves she visited, the flowers she favored. He never tried to speak to her again after that first night. He just observed, cared. I read until my eyes ached. The logs told the story of the cemetery, but they also told the story of my father, his quiet acceptance of a world that was not as simple as it seemed, his dedication to this place and all its inhabitants, both above the ground and below it. In the 1995 logbook, I found a single, longer entry. It wasn't an observation. It was a note. To himself. Or maybe, I realized with a jolt, to me. She is not a ghost in the way people think. She is a memory. A piece of this land's long memory. A child who loved this place and never wanted to leave. She tends to the ones no one else remembers. And so I will tend to her. This is the real work. Not cutting the grass, but bearing witness, making sure they are not alone. I closed the book, my vision blurring with tears. I looked around the small locked room. This wasn't a secret he was keeping. This was his life's work, his true purpose. He wasn't just a caretaker of the grounds. He was a keeper of stories, a guardian of the lost. And now he had passed the duty on to me. The locked room, the pics, the logs, it was all part of the inheritance. He wasn't telling me to stay because it was safe. He was asking me to stay because the work wasn't finished. After the locked room, everything changed. The shack wasn't just my dad's house anymore. It was a library of secrets. The cemetery wasn't just a field of graves. It was a living, breathing story, and I was its new narrator. I started keeping my own logbook. I didn't write down just the weather or the mowing. I wrote about her, the child in white. I noted the time she appeared, the flowers she carried, the graves she visited. It made me feel closer to my dad, like we were having a conversation across the years. I was following in his footsteps, quite literally, through the wet grass. For weeks, it was the same. The rain would come at night and she would appear, a silent, pale smudge in the darkness. I'd watch from the window, or sometimes I'd stand on the porch, just letting her know she was seen. I think that's all she ever wanted, to be seen. Then, one night, the pattern broke. The rain was heavier than usual, coming down in thick silver sheets. I saw her emerge from the gloom, but she wasn't carrying flowers. Her hands were empty, and she wasn't walking her usual route. She was walking straight towards the shack, my breath caught. I stood frozen by the window as she came closer. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her bare feet pale in the dark, wet grass. She lifted her head, and for the first time she looked right at me. Her face was small and pale, her eyes dark pools. Rainwater streamed down her cheeks like tears. She opened her mouth, and her voice was not what I expected. It wasn't a ghostly whisper. It was the sound of the rain itself, soft, hollow, and endlessly sad. "He promised," she said. The words hung in the air between us. I couldn't speak. I could only listen. He promised not to bury me here. And then she was gone. Not a fade, not a walk away. She was just gone. The space where she had been was empty, filled only with the falling rain. I stumbled back inside, my heart thumping. He promised. The words echoed in my head. Who was he? Her father? My father? I tried to shake it off. I made tea, but my hands were shaking so badly I slopped hot water on the counter. I sat in his chair, but I couldn't get comfortable. A strange, cold feeling was seeping into my bones. A memory that wasn't mine. It came in a flash. The smell of turned earth, thick and cloying. The weight of a small wooden box in my hands. A man's voice, rough with grief, saying, "I'm sorry, my love." "I had to," I gasped, dropping the teacup. It shattered on the floor, a mess of china and brown liquid. I clutched the arms of the chair, my knuckles white. That wasn't me. I'd never held a small wooden box. I'd never heard that voice. But the memory felt as real as the splintered wood of the desk under my fingers. The next day was a blur. I felt disconnected, like I was watching my own life from a distance. I tried to rake leaves near the pond, but the smell of the wet mud made my stomach lurch with that same feeling of deep, profound loss. That night, she came again. Same time, same rain, same empty hands. She stood in the same spot and looked up at me. Her dark eyes were pleading. "The stones are so cold," her rainy voice whispered. "I can't get warm." Another flash. This one was stronger. Lying down, a terrible crushing weight on my chest. Not earth. Something else. Something smooth and hard and cold. A lid. Darkness so complete it felt solid. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I cried out, stumbling back from the window and falling against the table. The logbooks wobbled. I was panting, sweat cooling on my forehead. It was a memory of being in a coffin, but it wasn't my memory. I looked back out the window. She was still there waiting. She wasn't giving me her memories. She was making me remember what happened to her. She was sharing her death with me. I finally found my voice. It was a dry, cracked thing. "Who are you?" I whispered into the glass. She tilted her head. A tiny, sad gesture. "I'm the one he forgot," she said. And then, softer. "I'm the one you're forgetting to remember." And with that, she vanished again, leaving me alone with the ghost of her final moments clinging to my mind like cobwebs. I knew then that this was the next part of the duty. It wasn't enough to just see her. I had to listen. I had to remember for her, because someone else had promised they would, and they had failed. The memories that weren't mine became a part of me. They were like scars on my mind. The smell of fresh-cut pine, the coffin, the feeling of rough woolen cloth, a dress I never wore, the taste of medicine bitter on my tongue from a sickness I never had. I was remembering her life, her death. I stopped sleeping. I would just sit in the locked room, surrounded by my father's logbooks, reading and rereading his words. I was looking for a clue, a name, anything about a little girl who was buried here against a promise, but he never named her. He only ever called her the child in white. It was like he was protecting her. Or maybe he didn't know. The rain never stopped. It was my world now, a constant drumming soundtrack to my slow unraveling. I tried to leave once. I got in my car, my hands shaking on the wheel, and I drove for the gate. But before I reached it, a headache slammed into me, so violent and sudden I saw stars. It felt like my skull was splitting open, and underneath the pain, A single clear thought that wasn't my own. Don't go. I turned the car around. The headache faded. The rain welcomed me back. I was a prisoner. Just like her. It was on a Thursday, I think. The days had started to blur together. I was in the main room, trying to eat some soup when I noticed it. A cold draft. It was coming from the floor, near the back wall of the shack. I got on my hands and knees. There was a small, almost invisible gap in the floorboards, and the air coming from it was ice cold. It smelled of wet stone and something else. Something ancient. My heart started to pound. I found the crowbar in the tool shed. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I jammed the metal tip into the gap and pried. The wood groaned, then splintered. A section of the floorboard came up with a screech of nails. Underneath wasn't dirt. It was a set of rough stone steps, leading down into absolute darkness. The cold air poured out, making me shiver. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it down the stairs. The beam shook in my hand. I could see a dirt floor, a low, cramped space, a root cellar, or a tomb. I climbed down, the stone steps cold and slimy under my bare feet. The room was small, barely bigger than the desk upstairs. The walls were packed earth, held back by old, rotting timbers. And in the center of the room, resting on the ground, was a coffin. It was small, a child's coffin. The wood was dark and rough, unlike the polished boxes they use today. It looked handmade. My throat tightened. I didn't want to go closer, but I had to. I had to know. I took a step, then another. The beam of my flashlight trembled over the lid. There was no dust on it. It was clean, as if it had been cared for, and on the lid a name had been carved by hand. The letters were clumsy, deep grooves in the wood. I read it, and my world ended. It was my name, Sarah. No, it couldn't be. This was a trick. This was part of the memory sickness, the thing she was doing to my mind. I stumbled forward, my hand reaching out, my fingers tracing the carved letters. They felt real. The splinters caught on my skin. This was why the rain wouldn't let me leave. This was why I remembered her life. This was why my father had written stay. I wasn't just the new caretaker. I was a replacement. I fell to my knees in the dirt, sobs wrenching their way out of me. The memories crashed over me, no longer fragments, but a flood. I remembered the fever, the heat in my skin, my father's face, not the old man I knew, but a younger, terrified man leaning over me. "Don't leave me, Sarah, please!" I remembered the promise. His voice choked with tears. "I won't bury you in the cold ground. I'll keep you close. I'll always keep you close." He couldn't let me go, so he didn't. He built his shack over my coffin. He stayed with me for 30 years, talking to me, caring for me, watching over my ghost as it wandered the grounds I loved as a child. The little girl in the white dress was my own nightgown. The other graves I visited, they were the other children buried here, the other forgotten ones. I was tending to my own kind. I don't know how long I knelt there in the dirt, in the silent, cold dark, next to my own coffin. The tears eventually stopped. The shaking stopped. A deep, terrible calm settled over me. I climbed back up the stairs. I replaced the floorboard. I washed my face. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. I looked pale. I looked tired. I looked like a ghost who had just remembered she was dead. The rain was still falling. It would always be falling. I picked up my logbook. I turned to a fresh page. I picked up my father's pencil, and I began to write. Not what I saw, but what I remembered. My memories, my life, my death. I am Sarah. I am the caretaker of Blackwood Cemetery. I tend to the graves. I watch for the lost. And when the new caretaker comes, the one who will replace me when I finally fade, I will write a single word for them to find. I will write, "Stay, my name is Ben, and I have a system." That's what I told the guy from OmniSec anyway. During the interview, I laid it all out. The route, the timing, the procedure. I showed him the spreadsheets I'd made for my last job at the old textile warehouse. He'd nodded, looking impressed. "We need that kind of discipline at Hillside Memorial," he'd said. "It's a big property. Easy to get turned around," he wasn't kidding. Hillside wasn't a cemetery. It was a city of the dead. Built on a steep slope with winding paths that coiled around the hill like a snake. The headstones climbed all the way to the top, a silent stone audience looking down on the living world below. The job was simple, but strict. A night patrol. I had to hit 15 checkpoints, scattered from the main gate at the bottom to the old family mausoleums at the very peak. Each checkpoint was a small metal post with a scanner. I had to press my key fob against it. The system logged the time. All 15 had to be scanned between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. No exceptions. The system flags any missed checkpoints, the manager had told me. Automatic write-up. 3 write-ups and you're out. Like I said, I have a system. I'd calculated the walk to the minute. A steady, even pace. No running, no lollygagging. Just a machine moving through the night. My first shift was clear and cold. The moon was a sharp fingernail clipping in the sky. The air was so still I could hear the crunch of my own boots on the gravel from 100 feet away. It was peaceful, in a lonely sort of way. Checkpoint 1 by the main gate. Beep, 11:05 p.m., right on schedule. Checkpoint 2, near the flower shop. Beep, 11:17 p.m., checkpoint 3, at the base of the hill. Beep, 11:28 p.m. So far, so good. I fell into a rhythm. My flashlight beam cut a clean path ahead of me. The headstones stood in neat, silent rows. Some were old and crumbling, their names erased by time. Others were shiny and new, with fresh flowers wilting in the cold. I didn't think about them as people. They were landmarks, part of the route. I was making good time. Better than good. By the time I reached checkpoint 8, halfway up the hill, it was only 12:40 a.m. I was a full 10 minutes ahead of schedule. That's when I got cocky. I decided to take a shortcut. There was a narrow, overgrown path between 2 large oak trees that my map said would shave off 3 minutes. It wasn't an official path, but the grass was trampled down. Probably deer, I thought. The moment I stepped off the main gravel, the world changed. The trees closed in overhead, blocking the moon. The temperature dropped, a sudden chill that made me zip my jacket up to my chin. My flashlight beam seemed weaker here, like the darkness was drinking the light. I walked for what felt like 5 minutes, but my watch showed only 2 had passed. The path twisted and turned, and I couldn't see the main route anymore. A low, thick fog began to coil around my ankles, spilling out from between the graves. It wasn't there a second ago. My system brain was screaming at me. This is inefficient. This is a variable. Turn back, but I was stubborn. I kept walking. I finally pushed through a thicket of thorny bushes and found a clearing. And there was checkpoint 9. The metal post was there, right where it was supposed to be. I let out a sigh of relief and pulled out my key fob. Beep. The sound was wrong. It wasn't the sharp digital chirp I was used to. It was a dull, wet sound, like pressing a button on a waterlogged remote. I looked at the scanner's little screen. Instead of a green check mark, it showed 2 words in flickering red letters. Late. Proceed. Late? That was impossible. I was ahead of schedule. I looked at my watch. The digital numbers were a scrambled mess, just blinking zeros. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I pulled out my phone. No service. The screen was blank. Dead. The fog was getting thicker, rising to my knees. I could no longer see the path I'd come from. The only way was forward. To checkpoint 10, my perfect system was broken. The clock was ticking, and I had no idea what time it was. All I knew was that the scanner thought I was late, and I had to hit 6 more checkpoints before 3 a.m. I started to jog, my breath puffing in frantic clouds. The fog clung to my legs, cold and heavy. For the first time that night, I looked at the headstones not as landmarks, but as what they were, graves. And I had the creeping, terrible feeling that I was no longer alone on this hill, that something else was keeping time with me, watching from the mist, waiting to see if I would make my deadline. Panic is a cold fire in your veins. It makes you stupid. I was running now, my boots slipping on the wet grass, the fog coiling around my legs like cold, wet hands. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Late. Proceed. The words were burned into my vision. I had to make up the time. Checkpoint 10 was at a crossroads of 2 main paths, under a flickering old lamppost. I slammed my key fob against the scanner. Beep. This time it was a sharp, normal sound. The screen flashed green. On time. On time? But the last one said I was late. I stared at my watch, but it was still a mess of blinking zeros. I had no anchor. No idea where I stood in the night. I looked at the route map clutched in my trembling hand. Checkpoint 11 was supposed to be at the base of the Angel of Grief statue, about a 3-minute jog away. I took off, my lungs burning in the cold air. I found the statue easily. A white marble angel, her head bowed, her wings drooping as if the sorrow of the whole cemetery was piled on her shoulders. I shone my light around her base, looking for the familiar metal post. It wasn't there. I circled her once, then twice, my beam sweeping over the manicured grass, the flower beds, the gravel. Nothing. No metal post. No scanner. This had to be a mistake. I checked the map again. Yes, checkpoint 11. Coordinates placed it right here. But there was nothing. Just the grieving angel in me. A sick feeling started to grow in my gut. Maybe the last guard had knocked it over. Maybe it was being repaired. But OmniSec was a stickler for details. They would have told me. They would have updated the map. My system was crumbling. A missing variable, an error in the code. Driven by a desperate need to do something, I pulled out my key fob. It was stupid. There was nothing to scan. But I held it out anyway, pointing it at the empty space where the checkpoint should have been. And it beeped. The sound was soft, muffled, like it was coming from under a blanket. I froze, my arm still outstretched. The little light on the fob glowed a faint, sickly yellow. It had read something, but what? I knelt down, my knees sinking into the damp earth. I shone my flashlight on the spot. It was just grass, normal, wet grass, but the beep? It had come from right here. With a growing sense of dread, I started to dig. I didn't have a shovel, just my hands. I clawed at the turf, the cold mud seeping under my fingernails. The soil was soft, loose, too loose. It hadn't been disturbed in years, but it came up in thick, heavy clumps. About 6 inches down, my fingers scraped against something cold and smooth. Metal. I brushed the dirt away, my breath catching. It was the scanner. The same kind of metal post as all the others, its little screen dark, its surface caked in earth. But it wasn't planted in the ground. It was lying on its side, and it was old, rusted in a way that should have taken decades. It looked like it had been buried here for a very, very long time. My key fob beeped again on its own, the yellow light pulsing weakly. This was wrong. This was all wrong. Checkpoints were for security guards. They were supposed to be above ground, visible, a part of the route. They weren't supposed to be buried artifacts. I looked at the map again. Checkpoint 11 was clearly marked, but as I stared at the laminated paper, the ink for this one point seemed to swim, to fade. For a second, I could have sworn I saw a different number, a 17 maybe. Then it snapped back to 11. A cold realization dripped into my mind. This wasn't a mistake in my map. This was a checkpoint that wasn't meant for me, or maybe it wasn't meant for the living. The fog around the Angel of Grief seemed to thicken, growing colder. I could feel a pressure building in my ears like I was deep underwater. I stood up, backing away from the hole from the buried machine. I had to keep going. I had to finish the route. The scanner had registered my fob. It had to count. It had to. I looked at my useless watch. The zeros kept blinking. Zero boro. Zero duro. Zero duro. I was no longer following a schedule made by OmniSec. I was running on a different kind of time now, a time kept by the hill itself, and it was telling me I was behind. I stumbled away from the angel, leaving the buried checkpoint behind. I had 5 more to go. The higher I went, the colder it got and the thicker the fog became. It wasn't just water vapor anymore. It felt like a presence, a silent, watching audience to my failure. I was no longer a security guard following a system. I was a rat in a maze and the walls were closing in. And the worst part was, I had no idea what happened at 3 a.m. if you didn't finish. The manager never said. He'd just smiled that tight corporate smile and said, "Don't be late." I don't remember getting back to the guard shack. The rest of the night was a blur of fog and fear. I must have scanned the other checkpoints. I must have, because I'm still here, right? I remember the final one, checkpoint 15, was at the very peak of the hill, next to a massive black obelisk that speared up into the night. The scanner there beeped, its screen a violent bloody red. It didn't say late. It just flashed one word over and over, confirmed. I ran down the hill as if the graves themselves were reaching for my ankles. I didn't stop until I was inside the shack, the door locked, my back pressed against it. I slid to the floor, gasping for air, my whole body shaking. The first gray light of dawn was seeping through the windows. I had survived the night, but I felt wrong, hollowed out. My system, my perfect orderly system, had been shattered. The world didn't run on clocks and schedules. It ran on something older and much, much colder. The OmniSec manager called me that afternoon. His voice was cheery. "How was the first night, Ben? Any issues?" My mouth was dry. I wanted to scream about the fog, the buried checkpoint, the scrambled time. But the words wouldn't come. They sounded crazy, even in my own head. "No, sir," I heard myself say. "No issues." "A little foggy, that's all." "Great. Just remember to upload your body cam footage to the server." Company policy. We do a random audit now and then. The body cam. I'd forgotten about it. A small black clip-on camera on the shoulder of my jacket. It recorded everything. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Proof. There was proof of what happened. I pulled the camera off my jacket, my hand still unsteady. I connected it to the old computer in the shack. The file transferred slowly. I clicked play. The footage was grainy, tinted green from the night vision. There I was, at the start of my shift, confident, walking with my steady, measured pace. Checkpoint 1, checkpoint 2. It was strange watching myself. Like watching a ghost of a few hours ago, I fast-forwarded. There was the shortcut. The screen filled with static for a second as I stepped between the oak trees. When the picture cleared, the green was darker, the image fuzzier. I saw myself finding checkpoint 9, the one that beeped wrong. On the video, my voice was thin, tinny. "That's impossible," I was muttering. Then I fast-forwarded to the Angel of Grief. I watched myself on my knees, digging like a frantic animal. I saw my own hands, caked in mud, pulling the buried scanner from the earth. The audio picked up my ragged breathing. It was the sound of pure fear. I checked the time code on the video. According to this, I was at the Angel at 1:45 a.m., but my watch had been dead. The scanner had said I was late. Which time was real? I kept watching. I saw myself run off, leaving the hole open. The camera, fixed to my shoulder, showed the path ahead, the swirling fog. The footage jumped and glitched as I ran. I fast-forwarded through the other checkpoints, my own panicked form scurrying up the hill. I stopped at the timestamp for 3 a.m., the final checkpoint. The red confirmed. The video should have ended there. The shift was over. But the recording kept going. The time code ticked past 3:01. 3:02. Why was I still recording? I never turned it off. I was supposed to come straight back. On the screen, my camera-wearing self stood at the peak for a moment, then turned and started walking back down the hill, but not toward the shack. I was walking a different path, a path I had no memory of taking. The footage became jumpy again, filled with digital artifacts. The green tint flickered. At 3:07 a.m., the image stabilized. I was back at the Angel of Grief. I was standing over the open hole I had dug, staring down at the buried scanner. My back was to the camera. I was perfectly, utterly still. The fog curled around my legs, so thick it looked solid. Then slowly, I turned. The camera caught my face in the grainy green light. My eyes were wide open, too wide, staring straight into the lens but not seeing it. They were blank like the eyes of a fish. My mouth was slightly open. There was no expression, no fear, no confusion. Nothing. It was the face of a man who was just empty. Rain began to speckle the lens, distorting the image. Or was it rain? It looked like the fog was condensing right on the camera, weeping onto the glass. I watched myself stand there, unmoving for another 3 full minutes. Just a statue with a dead man's eyes. Then the footage cut to static. I sat back in the chair, my blood turned to ice. I had no memory of that, no memory at all. I remembered running back to the shack. I remembered locking the door, but the video didn't lie. At 3:07 a.m., while I thought I was safe inside, I was still out there, standing in the rain, a hollow man over a hollow grave. I looked down at my hands. They were clean now. I'd scrubbed the mud from under my nails, but as I stared at them, I could still feel the cold, wet earth. I could still see my own empty eyes staring back at me from the screen. The system wasn't just broken. It had recorded my failure. And a part of me, a part I couldn't remember, was still out there on the hill, standing guard over a secret that was never meant to be dug up. I must have passed out at the computer. The next thing I knew, a jolt went through me, a sharp metallic sound. My head was pressed against the cold steering wheel of my patrol car. The radio on the dash was spitting static. I jerked upright, my neck stiff and sore. It was dark. Pitch black. The kind of dark that only comes in the middle of the night. I was behind the wheel, still in my uniform. The engine was off. I was parked right in front of the guard shack. My shift started at 11 p.m. I always got here at 10:45 to get organized. I fumbled for my phone. The screen lit up, blinding me. The time read 10:59 p.m. No, that was impossible. It had been morning. I'd watched the footage. I looked down at my hands. They were clean. My jacket was dry. There was no mud on my boots. It was as if the previous night had been erased. A bad dream, but the feeling in my chest, that cold, hollow dread, that was real. It was a stone sitting where my heart should be. The radio on the dash crackled. A voice I recognized, Brenda, the dispatcher, came through, clear and normal. Unit 4, you there? Ready for your first check-in? Unit 4, that was me. My throat was too tight to speak. I picked up the handset, my fingers numb. Copy, I managed to croak. All right, Ben. You know the drill. 15 by 3. Have a quiet one. I dropped the handset. It clattered against the dash. This wasn't a dream. This was a reset. I had to get out of here. I turned the key. The engine cranked, groaned, but didn't turn over. The battery was dead. Perfectly, completely dead. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel. A trap. This whole place was a trap. The digital clock on the dash flipped to 11 p.m. A chime sounded from the company tablet mounted next to the radio. The screen lit up showing my route map. At the top, in bold red letters, it said, Shift status, incomplete. Beneath it was a list. Checkpoint 1, checkpoint 2, checkpoint 3, all the way to 15. Next to each one, instead of a time, was that same word. Incomplete. I scrolled down. The list went on and on. Pages of it. Dates going back weeks, months, maybe years. Every single checkpoint on every single night marked incomplete my predecessor, the guy before me. What was his name? They never said. I always just assumed he'd quit. Now I knew. He hadn't quit. He was still here, somewhere, still running his route. A cold paralysis crept up my legs. I couldn't move. I could only stare at that endless list of failures. This wasn't a job. It was a sentence. The clock read 11:05. Checkpoint 1 was due. A low electronic beep came from the tablet. A notification. Checkpoint 1 overdue. The word overdue pulsed in a slow red rhythm. It was a heartbeat. The cemetery's heartbeat. I didn't want to get out of the car. I wanted to sit here until I rotted. But something else was moving my body. A deep programmed instinct. The system. My system. It was all I had left. I opened the car door and stepped out into the cold. The air was still. No fog tonight. Just a vast, empty darkness. I picked up my flashlight from the passenger seat. My legs carried me to checkpoint 1, right by the gate. I pulled the key fob from my pocket. It felt heavier than before. Beep. The scanner lit up green. On time. I almost laughed. On time, what a joke. Time meant nothing here. I started walking. The same route. The same gravel crunching under my feet. But it was all different now. The headstones weren't just stone. They were markers. They were the other guards. The other prisoners who had walked this path and failed to finish. Their names were probably carved on them somewhere. I didn't take the shortcut. I stuck to the main path like it was a lifeline. Checkpoint 2, beep. Checkpoint 3, beep. I was a ghost going through the motions. My mind was back in the shack watching that footage. The empty eyes, the rain on the lens. That was my future. To become a hollow man, standing guard forever, I reached the angel of grief. Checkpoint 11. The ground was smooth. No hole, no buried scanner. The metal post stood where it was supposed to be, clean and new-looking. I scanned my fob beep. It didn't say late. It didn't say confirmed. It just beeped, and the light turned green. I kept moving, a sleepwalker on a track. I scanned the final checkpoint at the peak. 2:58 a.m. The screen flashed green. Route complete. For a second, a wild, stupid hope flared in my chest. Maybe it was over. Maybe I'd broken the cycle. I hurried back down the hill, almost running. The guard shack was there. My car was there. The engine would start now. I knew it. I slid into the driver's seat, my heart pounding with a feeling I hadn't felt in what seemed like years. Hope. I turned the key. Click, click, click. The battery was still dead. The clock on the dash flipped to 3:00 a.m. The company tablet chimed softly. I looked at it. The screen showed my route for the night. Every checkpoint had a green check mark, but at the very top, the shift status hadn't changed. It still read in unwavering red letters, shift status, incomplete. And then, right before my eyes, the green check marks began to vanish. One by one, turning back into that terrible final word, incomplete. The map reset itself. The time changed back to 11:00 p.m. The radio crackled. Brenda's voice, cheerful and empty. Unit 4, you there? Ready for your first check-in? I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes. I didn't pick up the handset. There was no point. Outside, the first drops of rain began to tap against the windshield. The shift never ends. The route is never complete. I am just a caretaker of an endless night, scanning checkpoints until my own name becomes one of the forgotten marks on a list that never, ever ends. My name is Elias, and for the last 6 months, my world has been this old churchyard, St. Bartholomew's. It's not a working church anymore. Hasn't been for decades. The city bought it, and now they're trying to fix it up. My job is to watch over it at night, to make sure the vandals don't smash the new stained glass, and that the rain doesn't undo all the work we did during the day. Mostly, that means sitting in a little trailer by the gate, drinking bad coffee, and walking the perimeter every couple of hours. But this week, it's different. They're working on the bell tower. The tower is the oldest part of the church. It's made of old, gray stone, and it leans just a little to the south like it's tired. The stairs inside are rotten, so the crew has a rickety metal scaffold built all the way up the side. My new duty, every night at midnight, is to climb that scaffold and check the tower for any new damage. Water leaks, mostly. The project manager, a guy named Dave, is obsessed with water damage. It's the rain, Elias, he'd tell me, his face all serious. It finds a way in. It always finds a way. He wasn't wrong. It had been raining for a week straight. A cold, steady drizzle that made the whole churchyard smell like wet stone and dead leaves. So at midnight, I geared up. A heavy raincoat, a hard hat with a light on it, and a clipboard with a damp log sheet. I left the warm, dry trailer and stepped out into the mist. The church loomed in the darkness, a black shape against a black sky. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water from the trees. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, lighting up the path to the scaffold. The metal framework was slick with rain. It creaked and groaned as I put my weight on the first ladder. I'm not a fan of heights, but a job's a job. I started to climb. It's a long way up. The higher I got, the colder the wind became, whipping the rain into my face. I didn't look down. I just focused on the next rung, the next platform. My breath puffed out in white clouds, swallowed by the dark. Finally, I reached the top platform, right outside the bell chamber. There's no door, just a large arched opening where the bells used to be. They were taken out for restoration, so the chamber is just a big, empty stone room. I stepped inside, grateful to be out of the wind. The air in here was dead and cold. My footsteps echoed. I shone my light around, looking for the telltale dark streaks of water on the walls. That's when I saw it. In the center of the stone floor, directly under the hole where the bell ropes used to hang, was a puddle. It wasn't a leak from the roof. The roof in here was solid. This was just a puddle, as if someone had spilled a bucket of water. I knelt down, my knees cracking in the quiet. I touched the water with my gloved finger. It was ice cold, and the stone around it was dry, completely dry. It made no sense. I shook my head. Probably just rain blown in by the wind. I was being jumpy. I stood up and continued my inspection. The walls were fine. No new cracks, no vandalism. I noted the puddle on my log sheet under miscellaneous. Dave would probably roll his eyes. I was about to leave when a sound made me freeze. It was a soft, metallic scrape. It came from above. From the very top of the tower, from the little spire where the old weather vane was. My heart did a little stutter. Pigeons, I told myself. It's always pigeons. They get in everywhere. I stood there listening for a full minute. Nothing. Just the moan of the wind and the constant patter of the rain. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and turned to go. As I stepped back out onto the scaffold, a powerful gust of wind slammed into the tower. The whole structure swayed just a little. It was a normal thing. The crew said it was designed to sway, but this time the wind carried a sound down to me. A sound that couldn't have been the wind, or the rain, or any bird. It was a clear, soft, single note. A chime. Like someone had gently tapped a single, perfect bell. I clung to the wet metal railing, my heart hammering. I looked up into the dark, rain-swept spire. There was nothing up there, no bell. Nothing to make that sound. The note hung in the air for a second, and then it was gone, swallowed by the storm. I scrambled down that scaffold so fast I almost slipped twice. I didn't stop until I was back in the trailer, the door locked, the heater on full blast. I sat there, dripping on the floor, and looked at my log sheet. 12:17 a.m. Observed unexplained water accumulation in bell chamber. Heard a single anomalous chime. I stared at the words. They looked crazy. Dave would think I was losing it. So I did what any sensible person would do. I picked up my pen, crossed out the last part, and simply wrote, "wind noise." But I knew what I heard. And as I sat there in the buzzing silence of the trailer, I couldn't shake the feeling that the rain wasn't the only thing trying to find a way into the old tower. Something was already in there, and it was just starting to make itself known. I didn't tell anyone about the chime. What was I supposed to say? Dave would have sent me for a drug test, so I kept it to myself. I told myself it was the wind whistling through a crack in the spire. I almost believed it. The next night, the rain was worse. It wasn't a drizzle anymore. It was a downpour, lashing against the trailer windows. Midnight came around again. The climb up the scaffold was terrifying. The metal was like an ice rink, and the wind tried to peel me off the ladder with every step. I was braced for it this time. The puddle was there again, in the exact same spot in the bell chamber. A perfect, still circle of water on the dry stone. I didn't even kneel down. I just noted it on the sheet and got out of there as fast as I could. No chime, nothing. I felt a little relieved. Maybe it had been a one-time thing. I got back to the trailer, soaked and shivering, and tried to dry off. I made some coffee, the steam fogging up the cold window. I watched the rain and tried to think about anything else. The clock on the wall ticked past 1:30 a.m., then 1:45, and then at exactly 2 a.m. it happened. The sound didn't come from outside. It wasn't carried on the wind. It was inside the trailer with me. A deep, resonant bronze bong. It vibrated in my chest, in my teeth. I jumped, sloshing hot coffee all over my hand. I stared around the tiny room. The sound was everywhere. Bong, a second chime. Just as clear, just as heavy. It was the sound of a massive bell, the kind that shakes a whole town. But the bells were gone. They were in a workshop across the city. Bonged a third. My coffee mug was shaking in my hand. I put it down before I dropped it. This wasn't wind. This wasn't in my head. This was real. I started counting, my lips moving silently, my heart a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. Bong! 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 It kept going. The sound was ancient. It felt old. Each chime was a physical weight pressing down on me. 10, 11, 12. I held my breath. 12 chimes. For midnight. It was over, but it wasn't. Bong, a 13th chime. This one was different. It was wrong. It was cracked, discordant. It didn't ring out cleanly. It shuddered through the air and then choked off, like the bell itself was in pain. Then, silence. The sudden quiet was louder than the bells had been. The only sound was the frantic patter of the rain and the blood roaring in my ears. I looked at the clock. 2:01 a.m., 13 chimes. At 2 a.m., it made no sense. None of it made any sense. The next day, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept. I went to the city archives in the public library basement. The old woman there helped me find the records for St. Bartholomew's. I told her I was working on the restoration, which was technically true. I found old ledgers, brittle and yellowed. Records of services, repairs, donations, And then, in a maintenance log from 1903, I found it. A single handwritten entry. June 14th. The great bell has developed a crack. It rings a 13th unholy tone past the witching hour. The bishop has ordered it silenced until it can be recast. God help us. My blood ran cold. They had silenced it, but it never got recast. The church fell into disuse. The project was abandoned. The bell wasn't supposed to ring, but it was. And I was the only one who could hear it. That night, I was a prisoner in my own trailer. As 2 a.m. approached, my hands were shaking. I didn't want to hear it again. I didn't want to feel that wrong 13th chime in my bones. But when the clock hit 2, then it came again. The same deep, resonant bongs shaking the very air. I sat there, rigid in my chair, counting them down. 10, 11, 12. I clenched my fists, waiting for the awful 13th bong. It was worse this time. It wasn't just cracked. It sounded wet, gurgling, like it was ringing from the bottom of a well. The sound didn't fade. It just stopped abruptly, leaving a hole in the world. I knew then that the bell wasn't just broken. It was ringing for a reason. It was marking an hour that didn't exist, a time outside of time. And for that one terrible minute, between the 12th chime and the 13th, something else was awake in the churchyard. Something that heard the call, and I was the only one listening. The 13th chime changed everything. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence. After it rang, the silence in the trailer felt different. Thicker, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stopped sleeping. I'd just sit in my chair, watching the clock, dreading the crawl of the hands towards 2 a.m. The rain never let up. It was my whole world now, a constant drumming reminder that the world outside was washing away, and I was trapped here with something that was not. Dave, the project manager, noticed. "You look like death warmed over, Elias," he said one morning, his brow furrowed. "You getting sick?" "Just the rain," I mumbled. "Can't sleep with all the noise." He'd clap me on the back. "Hang in there. Forecast says it'll break by the weekend." I didn't have the heart to tell him the forecast was wrong. The rain here felt permanent. My midnight climbs to the bell tower became a special kind of torture. I'd rush through the inspection, my flashlight beam jerking around the stone walls, my back always feeling exposed. The puddle was always there, a perfect impossible circle. I started to think of it as an eye, a wet, open eye staring up from the floor. Then, 3 nights after the chimes started, I saw him. I was finishing up in the bell chamber, about to step back out onto the rain-lashed scaffold. As I turned, my headlamp beam swept across the far wall, and there, leaning against the stones, was one of the old bell clappers. The crew must have found it and left it there. It was a massive hammer-shaped piece of blackened bronze, taller than me. Its surface was old and pitted, but the rain had polished one side to a dark, oily shine. It was like a distorted mirror, and in that distorted mirror I saw my reflection. But it wasn't me. Oh, it had my face, my raincoat, my hard hat. But this version of me was wrong. His shoulders were slumped, not with tiredness, but with a deep, weary sadness. Water streamed down his face, but he wasn't blinking it away. He was just standing there, soaked to the bone, with a small, gentle smile on his lips. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. That smile. It wasn't happy. It was accepting. It was the smile of a man who had given up. A man who was perfectly, utterly at peace with his own drowning. I stumbled back, my boots scraping on the stone. My heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I whipped my head around to look behind me at the empty space where the reflection should have been. There was no one there. I spun back to the bronze clapper. The surface was just dark, pitted metal now. My own reflection was back, wide-eyed, pale, gasping for air. The smiling man was gone. I didn't wait. I practically fell out of the bell chamber and scrambled down the scaffold, the metal shaking and groaning under my frantic weight. I didn't feel the rain. I didn't feel the cold. All I felt was the ghost of that smile burned onto the back of my eyes. That night, the chimes came again. At 2 a.m., right on schedule. I was curled up in my chair, my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't in the air. It was in me, bong. Bong, bong. I counted them, tears of pure fear leaking from my eyes. Each chime was a hammer blow to my soul. 10, 11, 12. I braced myself, my whole body tensed for the awful, wet 13th note. But this time, something different happened. After the 12th chime, there was a pause. A silence that stretched out longer than before. It was a listening silence. And in that silence, I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic sound underneath the rain. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of water dripping from a body, from wet clothes. It was coming from inside the trailer. I slowly lowered my hands from my ears. My breath hitched in my throat. I was too scared to turn around, too scared to look. The dripping sound was right behind my chair, and then the 13th chime rang. It didn't come from the tower. It came from right behind me. It was that same wet, gurgling sound, but this time it was close. So close I could feel the vibration in the floor. The sound faded, and the dripping stopped. I sat there for the rest of the night, unable to move, unable to breathe. The first gray light of dawn finally revealed an empty trailer. There were no puddles on the floor, no footprints, but the memory was there. The smiling, soaked man in the bronze, the dripping behind my chair. They were connected. The bell wasn't just ringing for me, it was ringing for him, and he was getting closer. With every 13th chime, he was stepping out of that bronze reflection and into my world. I was no longer just the listener. I was becoming the audience for a performance that had been waiting 100 years to finish. And I had a terrible, sinking feeling that when the final curtain fell, I wouldn't be in the audience anymore. I would be on the stage wearing his soaked clothes, wearing his peaceful, drowned man's smile. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a frantic, angry sound in the dark. I fumbled for it, my eyes gummed shut with sleep. The screen glowed with Mark's name. Mark? Dude, it's 2 a.m. His voice was a ragged whisper, stripped raw. Jake, you gotta come. You gotta take the shift. I sat up, the blankets pooling around my waist. What? What are you talking about? Take what shift? The cemetery. Oakwood. I can't stay here another second. I could hear the rain pounding on his end, a constant roaring static. The keys are under the mat at the guard shack. Just tell them you're my cousin. Please, man. Mark, are you okay? You sound... It's the rain, Jake. He cut me off, his voice dropping even lower. It never stops. And it gets in. Just come, please. The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, my heart thumping. Mark was a tough guy, an ex-Marine. I'd never heard him sound like that. He sounded broken, and I needed the money. My job at the warehouse had dried up last month. Rent was due, so against every sensible bone in my body, I got dressed. I threw on a hoodie and jeans, grabbed my coat, and drove across town to Oakwood Cemetery. The rain was a solid wall of water. My wipers were on full blast, but they could barely keep up. The cemetery gates were open, like a dark mouth. I drove through, my headlights reflecting off a million puddles, turning the world into a broken mirror. The guard shack was a small, lit-up box in the middle of all that darkness. I parked next to Mark's beat-up pickup truck. The driver's door was open, the interior light on, painting the falling rain a sickly yellow. It was empty, my skin prickled. "Mark," I called out. My voice was swallowed by the downpour. I found the keys under the dirty welcome mat, just like he'd said. The shack was a mess. A coffee mug lay shattered on the floor. The chair was knocked over. On the desk, the logbook was open. The last entry in Mark's usually neat handwriting was a single scrawled sentence. "The rain has a face." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. This was a bad idea. This was a really, really bad idea. But then I thought about my empty bank account, my landlord's face. I righted the chair. I sat down. The job was simple. Make a patrol of the grounds every 2 hours. That's it. Just walk the loop and make sure no one's spray painting the mausoleums or digging up graves. A warm body in a chair. That's all I had to be. My first patrol was at 3 a.m. Stepping out of the shack was like walking into a cold shower. The rain instantly soaked through my coat. My flashlight beam was a weak, trembling star in the endless dark. Oakwood was old. The headstones leaned into each other, their names worn smooth by 100 years of weather. The paths were mud, sucking at my shoes. The further I walked from the shack, the smaller I felt. The graveyard didn't feel like a place. It felt like a condition, a state of being, wet, dark and endless. Halfway through the loop, I heard it. A sound underneath the rain. A voice. It was faint, like a radio playing in a house down the street. I couldn't make out the words, just the murmur of it. A man's voice, low and conversational. I stopped, my heart in my throat. "Hello?" I called out. "Mark, that you?" The voice stopped. The only sound was the rain's relentless hiss. My mind raced. It was probably just the wind, or water running through an old drain pipe. That had to be it. I kept walking, quicker now, my flashlight beam jumping at every shadow. I finished the loop and practically fell back into the shack, locking the door behind me. I was shivering, but not from the cold. I looked at the logbook. At Mark's last crazy words, "The rain has a face." I poured a cup of bitter old coffee from the thermos he'd left behind. My hands were shaking. This was just a job. A weird, creepy job, but just a job. Mark had spooked himself. That's all. I spent the next 2 hours staring at the wall, listening to the drumming on the roof. It was a constant pounding rhythm. After a while, I started to hear patterns in it, like a code, a heartbeat. When it was time for my next patrol, I almost didn't go. But the thought of losing this paycheck, small as it was worse than the fear. I picked up the flashlight and stepped back out into the storm. This time, I didn't hear a voice. This time, from the direction of the oldest, most crowded part of the graveyard, I saw a light, a soft, golden glow bobbing slowly between the headstones. Like someone was carrying a lantern, my blood went cold. No one should be out here. No one alive. I stood there, frozen in the mud, watching that light move. It weaved through the graves with a purpose. It wasn't lost. It was visiting, and then as suddenly as it appeared, it winked out. I was alone again. Just me and the rain and the endless sleeping dead. I knew then that Mark hadn't just spooked himself. He'd seen something. He'd heard something. And now I was the warm body in the chair, listening to the rain, waiting for my turn to see it too. The 13th chime changed everything. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence. After it rang, the silence in the trailer felt different, thicker, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stopped sleeping. I'd just sit in my chair watching the clock, dreading the crawl of the hands towards 2 a.m. The rain never let up. It was my whole world now, a constant drumming reminder that the world outside was washing away and I was trapped here with something that was not. Dave, the project manager, noticed. "You look like death warmed over, Elias," he said one morning, his brow furrowed. "You getting sick?" "Just the rain," I mumbled. "Can't sleep with all the noise." He'd clapped me on the back. "Hang in there. Forecast says it'll break by the weekend." I didn't have the heart to tell him the forecast was wrong. The rain here felt permanent. My midnight climbs to the bell tower became a special kind of torture. I'd rush through the inspection, my flashlight beam jerking around the stone walls, my back always feeling exposed. The puddle was always there, a perfect impossible circle. I started to think of it as an eye. A wet, open eye staring up from the floor. Then, 3 nights after the chimes started, I saw him. I was finishing up in the bell chamber, about to step back out onto the rain-lashed scaffold. As I turned, my headlamp beams swept across the far wall, and there, leaning against the stones, was one of the old bell clappers. The crew must have found it and left it there. It was a massive, hammer-shaped piece of blackened bronze, taller than me. Its surface was old and pitted, but the rain had polished one side to a dark, oily shine. It was like a distorted mirror, and in that distorted mirror I saw my reflection, but it wasn't me. Oh, it had my face, my raincoat, my hard hat. But this version of me was wrong. His shoulders were slumped, not with tiredness, but with a deep, weary sadness. Water streamed down his face, but he wasn't blinking it away. He was just standing there, soaked to the bone, with a small, gentle smile on his lips. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. That smile. It wasn't happy. It was accepting. It was the smile of a man who had given up. A man who was perfectly, utterly at peace with his own drowning. I stumbled back, my boots scraping on the stone. My heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I whipped my head around to look behind me, at the empty space where the reflection should have been. There was no one there. I spun back to the bronze clapper. The surface was just dark, pitted metal now. My own reflection was back, wide-eyed, pale, gasping for air. The smiling man was gone. I didn't wait. I practically fell out of the bell chamber and scrambled down the scaffold, the metal shaking and groaning under my frantic weight. I didn't feel the rain. I didn't feel the cold. All I felt was the ghost of that smile burned onto the back of my eyes. That night, the chimes came again, at 2:00 a.m. right on schedule. I was curled up in my chair, my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't in the air. It was in me. Bong! 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 I counted them, tears of pure fear leaking from my eyes. Each chime was a hammer blow to my soul. 10, 11, 12. I braced myself, my whole body tensed for the awful, wet 13th note. But this time, something different happened. After the 12th chime, there was a pause. A silence that stretched out longer than before. It was a listening silence. And in that silence, I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic sound underneath the rain. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of water dripping from a body, from wet clothes. It was coming from inside the trailer. I slowly lowered my hands from my ears. My breath hitched in my throat. I was too scared to turn around. Too scared to look. The dripping sound was right behind my chair. And then, the 13th chime rang. It didn't come from the tower. It came from right behind me. It was that same wet, gurgling sound, but this time it was close. So close I could feel the vibration in the floor. The sound faded, and the dripping stopped. I sat there for the rest of the night, unable to move, unable to breathe. The first gray light of dawn finally revealed an empty trailer. There were no puddles on the floor. No footprints, but the memory was there. The smiling, soaked man in the bronze, the dripping behind my chair. They were connected. The bell wasn't just ringing for me, it was ringing for him, and he was getting closer. With every 13th chime, he was stepping out of that bronze reflection and into my world. I was no longer just the listener. I was becoming the audience for a performance that had been waiting 100 years to finish. And I had a terrible, sinking feeling that when the final curtain fell, I wouldn't be in the audience anymore. I would be on the stage, wearing his soaked clothes, wearing his peaceful, drowned man's smile. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a frantic, angry sound in the dark. I fumbled for it, my eyes gummed shut with sleep. The screen glowed with Mark's name. Mark? Dude, it's 2 a.m. His voice was a ragged whisper, stripped raw. Jake, you gotta come. You gotta take the shift. I sat up, the blankets pooling around my waist. What? What are you talking about? Take what shift? The cemetery. Oakwood, I can't stay here another second. I could hear the rain pounding on his end, a constant roaring static. The keys are under the mat at the guard shack. Just tell them you're my cousin. Please, man. Mark, are you okay? You sound... It's the rain, Jake. He cut me off, his voice dropping even lower. It never stops. And it gets in. Just come, please. The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, my heart thumping. Mark was a tough guy, an ex-Marine. I'd never heard him sound like that. He sounded broken, and I needed the money. My job at the warehouse had dried up last month. Rent was due, so against every sensible bone in my body, I got dressed. I threw on a hoodie and jeans, grabbed my coat, and drove across town to Oakwood Cemetery. The rain was a solid wall of water. My wipers were on full blast, but they could barely keep up. The cemetery gates were open like a dark mouth. I drove through, my headlights reflecting off a million puddles, turning the world into a broken mirror. The guard shack was a small, lit-up box in the middle of all that darkness. I parked next to Mark's beat-up pickup truck. The driver's door was open, the interior light on, painting the falling rain a sickly yellow. It was empty. My skin prickled. "Mark?" I called out. My voice was swallowed by the downpour. I found the keys under the dirty welcome mat, just like he'd said. The shack was a mess. A coffee mug lay shattered on the floor. The chair was knocked over. On the desk, the logbook was open. The last entry, in Mark's usually neat handwriting, was a single scrawled sentence. "The rain has a face." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. This was a bad idea. This was a really, really bad idea. But then I thought about my empty bank account. My landlord's face. I righted the chair. I sat down. The job was simple. Make a patrol of the grounds every 2 hours. That's it. Just walk the loop and make sure no one's spray painting the mausoleums or digging up graves. A warm body in a chair. That's all I had to be. My first patrol was at 3 a.m. Stepping out of the shack was like walking into a cold shower. The rain instantly soaked through my coat. My flashlight beam was a weak, trembling star in the endless dark. Oakwood was old. The headstones leaned into each other, their names worn smooth by 100 years of weather. The paths were mud sucking at my shoes. The further I walked from the shack, the smaller I felt. The graveyard didn't feel like a place. It felt like a condition, a state of being, wet, dark, and endless. Halfway through the loop, I heard it. A sound underneath the rain, a voice. It was faint, like a radio playing in a house down the street. I couldn't make out the words, just the murmur of it. A man's voice, low and conversational. I stopped, my heart in my throat. "Hello," I called out. "Mark, that you?" The voice stopped. The only sound was the rain's relentless hiss. My mind raced. It was probably just the wind, or water running through an old drain pipe. That had to be it. I kept walking, quicker now, my flashlight beam jumping at every shadow. I finished the loop and practically fell back into the shack, locking the door behind me. I was shivering, but not from the cold. I looked at the logbook. At Mark's last crazy words, "The rain has a face," I poured a cup of bitter old coffee from the thermos he'd left behind. My hands were shaking. This was just a job. A weird, creepy job, but just a job. Mark had spooked himself. That's all. I spent the next 2 hours staring at the wall, listening to the drumming on the roof. It was a constant pounding rhythm. After a while, I started to hear patterns in it, like a code, a heartbeat. When it was time for my next patrol, I almost didn't go. But the thought of losing this paycheck, small as it was worse than the fear. I picked up the flashlight and stepped back out into the storm. This time, I didn't hear a voice. This time, from the direction of the oldest, most crowded part of the graveyard, I saw a light, a soft golden glow bobbing slowly between the headstones. Like someone was carrying a lantern. My blood went cold. No one should be out here. No one alive. I stood there, frozen in the mud, watching that light move. It weaved through the graves with a purpose. It wasn't lost. It was visiting. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, it winked out. I was alone again. Just me and the rain and the endless sleeping dead. I knew then that Mark hadn't just spooked himself. He'd seen something. He'd heard something. And now I was the warm body in the chair, listening to the rain, waiting for my turn to see it too. I didn't sleep. How could I? I just sat in that hard chair, staring at the door, listening to the rain. That little golden light was burned into my mind. A lantern. Who uses a lantern anymore? When the darkness outside began to soften to a wet, miserable gray, I finally let myself breathe. Dawn. I had survived the night. I gathered my things, my body aching with tiredness, and stumbled out to my car. The rain was still falling, but it felt less threatening in the dim morning light. I drove home, took a hot shower, and fell into my bed. But I didn't dream of silence. I dreamed of the rain and of that bobbing golden light, always just out of reach. I spent the whole day jumping at every sound. The drip of my kitchen faucet sounded like footsteps. The hum of my refrigerator was that low, murmuring voice. I was a mess. I thought about calling Mark, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I thought about not going back, but rent was still due. So, when evening rolled around, I got back in the car and drove to Oakwood. The rain was waiting for me. It felt like it had never stopped. The second night was worse. The fear was no longer a surprise. It was an expectation. I sat in the shack, my knee bouncing up and down, watching the clock tick towards my first patrol. I didn't want to go back out there. I didn't want to see that light again. But at 11 p.m., I forced myself up. I picked up the flashlight like it was a weapon and stepped into the storm. This time, I saw them almost immediately. Not one light, several. They were white lights this time, the beam of flashlights, cutting through the rain over in the new section of the cemetery. They moved slowly, deliberately, between the rows of newer, shinier headstones. 3, maybe 4 of them. My blood ran cold. Vandalism. This had to be it. Kids messing around. That was a problem I could understand, a problem I could handle. I clicked off my own flashlight. I wouldn't give myself away. I moved quietly, keeping to the shadows of the bigger monuments, my shoes sinking into the soft grass. The voices were back too, a low murmur of conversation, just like the night before. I still couldn't make out the words, but it sounded normal, calm. I got closer, ducking behind a tall marble angel. I was maybe 50 feet away. I could see the beams of their lights dancing over the engraved names. I took a deep breath, ready to shout, to scare them off. I stood up and flicked my own powerful flashlight on, aiming it right at them. "Hey, this is private property. You need to..." The lights went out, all of them, at once. Not like someone turned them off, like they were snuffed out. The voices stopped mid-sentence. The silence that rushed in was absolute, broken only by the rain. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small and stupid. I swept my beam across the rows of graves. Nothing, no one running, no footsteps splashing in the mud. It was an open field. There was nowhere to hide that quickly. They were just gone. My heart was hammering. I walked forward, my light trembling over the ground where I'd seen them. The grass was trampled. There were footprints in the mud. But that wasn't the weird part. At the base of 3 different headstones, there were fresh flowers, not old, wilted bouquets. These were new. White lilies, their petals perfect and open, beaded with rainwater. They looked like they had been placed there seconds ago. I stood there for a long time, getting soaked, staring at those flowers. They weren't there during my last patrol. I was sure of it. Someone had just put them there. But who? And how did they vanish into thin air? The rest of my shift was a long, cold nightmare. Every time I patrolled, I saw the lights. Sometimes in the old section, sometimes near the mausoleum. A small group of them moving peacefully, quietly. I never tried to confront them again. I just watched from a distance, a sick feeling in my stomach. I'd see the lights hovering around a grave for a minute, and then they'd blink out. And when I worked up the courage to go check, I'd find another fresh flower, a rose, a carnation. Always white, always pristine. They weren't vandals. They weren't kids. They were visitors. But they weren't visiting during the day in the sunlight with their families. They were visiting now, in the endless pouring rain, in the middle of the night. I was the night watchman. I was supposed to be watching for the living. But the people I was seeing, I didn't think they were alive, and I didn't think they meant any harm. They were just carrying on, remembering their loved ones in the only time they had left. I was just the intruder here. The one who didn't understand the rules. I was guarding a place that didn't need a guard. I was just the guy stuck in the shack, watching the real caretakers do their work forever in the rain. The flowers kept appearing. Every night. White lilies, white roses, white carnations. They were the only spots of color in all that gray and green and mud. I stopped being scared of the lights. What was the point? They were just doing their thing, and I was just watching. But the silence was getting to me. The rain was a constant, but it was a lonely sound. I needed to talk to someone, anyone. I needed to hear that Mark was okay, that he'd just cracked under the pressure and was now sleeping it off somewhere warm and dry. On the 4th morning, after my shift ended, I didn't go home. I drove to the office of the company that ran the security contract, OmniSec. It was in a bland, beige office park on the other side of town. I walked in, the bell on the door jingling too cheerfully. A woman with a tight blonde bun looked up from her computer. "Can I help you?" "Yeah, hi," I said, trying to sound normal. "I'm Jake. I'm covering for Mark." He asked me to take over his shift at Oakwood Cemetery. I just wanted to check in, make sure the paperwork was all straight. She blinked at me. "Mark?" "Yeah, Mark. Big guy, ex-Marine." She turned to her computer, her fingers clacking on the keyboard. She frowned. "I'm not seeing any Mark on the Oakwood account. The last guard there was let's see, a Robert Higgins. He retired 3 months ago. The position's been vacant." A cold trickle started down my spine. No, that can't be right. "My friend Mark, he called me. He was desperate. He left his truck there. The keys are under the mat." She gave me a polite customer service smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, we have no record of a Mark ever being employed by us. And we certainly wouldn't leave keys under a mat. That's a massive security breach." I felt the world tilt a little. but I've been working there for 4 nights. According to our system, she said, her voice flat, no one has been working the Oakwood night shift for the last 3 months. The client hasn't paid for it. I must have looked as crazy as I felt, because her smile became strained. Perhaps your friend was playing a prank on you? I stumbled out of the office, the bright sunlight feeling wrong. A prank? Mark wasn't the prank type, and his fear on that phone call, that was real. I drove back to the cemetery. I didn't go home. I parked outside the gates and waited. The rain started again, of course. It was always waiting. When it was dark, I went back to the guard shack. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My half-empty coffee mug, the logbook, Mark's scrawled entry, "The rain has a face." I picked up the logbook, my hands shaking. I flipped back through the pages. Entries from Robert Higgins, neat and boring. Saw a deer. Wind knocked over a trash can. Then nothing for a few pages. And then Mark's writing started. And then mine. But to Omnisec, none of this existed. I needed proof. Something with my name on it. A pay stub. An ID number. Anything. I started tearing the shack apart. I pulled out drawers. Emptied filing cabinets. All I found were old manuals, dead pens, a dusty first aid kit. Then, in the very bottom drawer, stuck to the underside, I found a small metal badge. It was tarnished and old. It had the Omnisec logo on it and an employee number 734. My hands were ice cold. This was it. This was proof. Maybe it was Mark's, maybe it was Robert's, but it was something. I didn't know what to do, so I did the only thing I could think of. I went on patrol. The rain was my companion now, my only companion. I walked the loop, my mind racing. No job, no Mark. What was I doing here? Why was I still here? I found myself in the oldest part of the cemetery, where the stones were so worn they looked like melting candles. My flashlight beam danced over the dates. 1800s, early 1900s. And then the beam stopped. It landed on a small, simple headstone. It was cleaner than the others around it, as if the rain had recently washed it. The name was gone, worn away, but the dates were still clear. Born, March 14th, 1985, died, October 31st, 2005, and below the dates, carved into the stone was a number. 34. I dropped my flashlight. It hit the mud with a soft thud, the light pointing up, illuminating the falling rain like tiny silver needles. No, it couldn't be. I fell to my knees, the mud soaking through my pants. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the number. The stone was cold and rough. It was real, employee number 734. This grave was 20 years old. The pieces crashed together in my mind, sharp and cutting. The lights that weren't there. The voices on the wind. The flowers that appeared from nowhere. Omnisec having no record of me. Mark didn't call me to take over his shift. He called me to take over my shift. The reason I needed the money so badly. The reason my life felt so empty and stalled. I couldn't remember the last time I'd talked to my family. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen the sun without rain. I looked down at the old, tarnished badge in my hand. It wasn't Mark's. It wasn't Robert's. It was mine. I had been here all along. I was the one who had been watching the lights. I was one of them. A permanent resident, just playing night watchman for all eternity, forgetting who I was, shift after shift after shift. I looked up into the endless weeping sky. And for the first time, I didn't see the rain. I saw my own reflection staring back at me from 1,000 falling drops. A ghost finally remembering his own name.